welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, and your boy on social media at MMALOTN. This week we're talking about UFC Vegas 112, which is headlined by a flyweight matchup between former title challenger Brandon Royval and the oncoming Manel Kape. We've had this fight scheduled a few times. Knock on wood, we actually get to see them throw down this weekend. It is also the last UFC event of the calendar year before they take off, I believe it's 5 weekends in a row, and then return in January, on January 24th with UFC 324, which is obviously headlined by Justin Gaethje and Paddy Pimblett, but is also the first event on Paramount Plus. So there will be a lot of moving parts in terms of where you can watch these fights come the new year. But first, we got business to handle at the Apex with this UFC Vegas 112 card. Reminder, there is also PFL Europe 4 going down this weekend, I believe in the morning/afternoon, since it is taking place in France. It does have a pretty big headliner between Vadim Nemkov and Renan Ferreira. And then in the co-main event, you got the return of Chris Cyborg taking on Sarah Collins. I'll be dropping the breakdown for that video on Thursday, so don't worry about that. I'll have that covered for you guys as well. And that will be the last of my full card breakdowns for the year. I will still be covering KSW 113, PFL Africa 4, and OKTAGON 81 before the year is up. And I'll consider whether I drop breakdowns for those on the YouTube page, but I will for sure be dropping written breakdowns and track plays for those cards on the MMALOTN Patreon page. So make sure you guys check that bad boy out if you still want some action going into the new year. And then obviously even before the first UFC event of 2026, I should have a few cards that I'm going to be covering on the regional scene for those on the Patreon page as well. So maybe I'll drop main event breakdowns for those cards to end the year, and then obviously let you guys know to hop on over to the Patreon page for the rest of them, but we'll see how the rest of the week goes. I am looking forward to the break. I'm looking forward to a few weeks off to just chill and settle into the new place. As you guys can see, the studio is still not what I want it to be. I'm actually in my living room right now, or a part of my living room, so the backspace right now is being slowly populated by my wife's things, but once the studio slowly starts coming together, I just got my desk finally, and I'm trying to pick out what I want the background to be. But for the next week or so, or at least until the new year, this is going to be the background for now with my wife's things and crafts and some of her books and stuff. So that's what we're going to have to deal with for now. But really looking forward to showcasing the new studio and the new look come 2026. Still a few weeks away from that though. Let's do a quick recap for the last UFC event in terms of our lock of the night and dog of the night plays, and then we'll get into the breakdowns here. The lock of the night play, probably the chalkiest lock of the night play I've had all year, but seeing how it went down, it was for good reason. I went with the Chris Duncan and Terrence McKinney under 1.5 rounds at -339, and given the way McKinney fights, that guy is never going to change the way that he fights, and that's now 12 of his 12 UFC fights finishing under 1.5 rounds. Only 10 of those only 2 of those going into the second round. This one did not need that, as Duncan was able to keep his durability about him and find that big shot to put McKinney away, and then follow up with a lot of ground and pound as well. We cash our lock of the night play there. We did cash one other lock of the night play for one of the regional cards. I believe it was Cage Warriors with Ryan Campbell at -200. So that now brings our lock of the night record to 61-38 on the year for a 62% hit rate. Again, on the lower side of what I was kind of expecting this year. We still got a few events to try to crack that black at least. We are in the red right now, I believe about -10 units, but I'm not going to chase anything. If I see a lock of the night play I like on some of these regional shows to end the year, I'll maybe take a shot on them. But if it means that I have to end in the red for the lock of the night plays, I won't be scared to let that be, and hopefully have a good start to the new year once we turn the calendar year here. For the dog of the night play, there was not all that much resistance that we had to deal with for UFC 323, as we had Joshua Van, who is the new flyweight champion, who dominated Alexandre Pantoja and finished him within 30 seconds. Now, I can't do that. I tried keeping up that bluff for a little bit longer than I wanted to. We obviously know that Pantoja injured his arm on a weird scrambling scenario, and Van wins the title on an injury. Not too much to gloat about there. Don't really want to be running victory laps here, saying that I called that and was one of the few guys to call it. But I hope one day we can see those guys end up rematching each other. We might see Van end up facing Tatsuro Taira in the meantime, and that may end up being a more difficult matchup given the injury that Pantoja is going to have to come back from, his age and all that. Maybe Taira is just a younger and better version at this point, but we'll see how that fight plays out when it does. I believe we went 2-1 on the weekend for Dog of the Night plays. I can't recall the other two off the top of my head, but our Dog of the Night record for the year is now 57-68 for a 46% hit rate, and firmly in the profit there. No matter what happens in the remaining events on the year, we'll still be firmly in the profit, so I'll be happy about that once we end off 2025. All right, that's a wrap on the recaps there. I've already done my plugs, so let's start breaking down this 12-fight UFC Vegas 112 card, and it starts off in the women's flyweight division as we have Jamie Lynn Horth coming in at plus 125, going up against Teresa Bleda, who comes in at minus 145. Now, Horth is coming off of a dominant victory where she was a minus 500 favorite against Vanessa Demopoulos. She was able to stop the 5 takedown attempts of Demopoulos, even landed 2 of her own, but it was her striking that got her the win that night as she outstruck Demopoulos 101-36 on significant strikes and was doing good work all 15 minutes, touching up Demopoulos from distance and putting a stamp on it once the fight hit the scorecards. That allowed Horth to bounce back from her second UFC loss, which she had felt at the hands of Miranda Maverick back in June. And that was a fight where she really only had success in the second round, but in the first and third rounds, Maverick got to her grappling game, and that showed the flaws in Horth's style. Horth is normally a physically and very strong opponent in this flyweight division, utilizing her clinch and her striking to pick her opponents apart. And she was very dominant on the regional scene, finishing all, I believe, 5 of her wins before coming over to the UFC. But a lot of it had to do with her strength and how nasty she is when she gets inside the clinch. But as we saw with Demopoulos and with Maverick, the grappling is where Horth will struggle if she can't keep fights upright. And she's going to be facing a lot of that here against Teresa Bleda, who's going to be coming back from over 2.5 years away from action after she dealt with a handful of injuries, and I believe she even dealt with a little bit of staph infection. But at 24 years old, she still has plenty of time to leave her mark in the UFC and achieve the very high ceiling that a lot of people have set for her. She came into that pro game with a 6-0 amateur record, and she even started off her career 6-0 as a pro before she ran into Natalia Silva in her first UFC matchup. Had some good success in that first round, but started to slow down, and Silva was able to pick it up in the second and third rounds and eventually find that third round finish. But Bleda managed to hush the naysayers in her next matchup, taking on a dangerous Brazilian striker in Gabriela Fernandes, and she was able to land multiple takedowns that night and really control that fight, dominating it for 15 minutes and winning that fight on the scorecards, showing that she doesn't really have a gas tank issue. It's more so just being able to dictate the pace and fighting at her pace so that she can manage her gas tank well enough. Her striking is slowly coming together as well, but it's really about her grappling, and that's where I expect her to dominate Horth once this fight hits the ground. She'll have a 2-inch height and a 5-inch reach advantage, showcasing that she will be the bigger and stronger fighter once this fight gets going, and I think that will play out in her advantage. The only issue I have in terms of being fully confident on the Bleda side, and not saying it will stop me from betting her at this minus 145 number, is that 2.5-year-long layoff. She was scheduled to fight Horth back in June, I believe it was, so it's not like she hasn't been preparing for Horth in the past, but I think that we'll see her now come back healthier than ever and go out there and put on a dominant performance as she grinds out the Canadian and wins this fight on the scorecards. Next up, we got debuting heavyweights here as we have Alan Frye coming in at plus 160, going up against Guilherme Pat, who comes in at minus 185. Now, both these guys were actually signed by the UFC in that swarm of heavyweight signings that they had a few months back, and I believe these are the last few guys to make their debuts now after the other ones were signed as well. Frye comes in with a 6-0 record, training out of Brunson MMA in North Carolina, which is headed by former former top middleweight Derek Brunson, and Frye seems to be one of his more promising prospects to come out of that gym after opening up his doors a few years ago. Frye is a guy that's made short work of pretty much all of his opponents. I believe he's finished 4 of his 6 opponents in the first round. His last win being a knockout victory over former UFC fighter, at least tough alum, Justin Frazier. Frazier was able to land a few takedowns and really muzzle Frye up against the cage, but once Frye was able to get back into open distance, he let go with the striking and he eventually found a finish with a TKO finish. With that said, though, that was the first fight for Frazier in over 6 years, so he was kind of coming off the couch there, had a little bit of success, so there are still a lot of question marks in terms of what the ceiling is for the Frye side of things here. Normally, he's dealing with guys that look to take him to the ground, but normally he stuffs those takedowns or immediately works back to his feet and then starts to let go with his hands. But he, just as Pat, are perfect examples of how easily heavyweights can make it into the UFC if they are in somewhat good shape and also have a basic understanding of the mixed martial arts game from the striking to the grappling. And I think that's largely why Frye has made it this far into his MMA career. Good striking, basic striking, I should say at that, has some stinging power as well, and has a good enough understanding of the grappling game to quickly work back to his feet if he is ever taken down. Now he's going up against an athletic specimen here in Guilherme Pat, who started his pro MMA career 5-0, although he did not look as good as Frye did in his last matchup, which was over a year and a half ago. Pat was scheduled for at least 2 fights in that time, but some of them fell through, including his Contender Series date that he had against Anthony Garasio. The UFC decided to pull that fight, put Pat straight into the UFC. I think he probably would have won that fight anyway. This guy's fast, explosive, has a lot of power in his hands as well, but his grappling defense is often where we see him get taken advantage of. Even though he has a clean 5-0 record, there are still some blemishes in his game considering the type of grappling success opponents have had against him in the past. Specifically, his last opponent, Quiras, at LFA 191, where Quiras, I thought, won about 2 rounds there, keeping Pat put up against the cage, dragging him to the ground, having some good success from on top, but Pat did not relent. He did not give up too dominant of a position. He was always able to work back to his feet and then get back to his striking advantage, which eventually worked out for him in that 3rd round where he was able to save his undefeated record. He's fast, he's explosive, has some good power, and I have to give him the edge here against Frye just due to those physical attributes. Sure, Frye might be able to come in with a good enough game plan to cause Pat some issues, taking him to the ground and wearing him down, but I think given the lack of legitimate tape we have on either guy, especially against legitimate opposition, it's hard for me to muster up the confidence on the Frye side of things here. I think we'll see Pat utilize his speed and explosivity to find that big shot on Frye, eventually get him out of there by knockout, but it's going to be hard to muster up confidence, especially at minus 185, knowing how big of a hole in his grappling he has. All right, next up in the women's bantamweight division, we got Luana Santos coming in at minus 125, going up against Melissa Croden, who comes in at plus 105. Now, Santos is coming off of a submission victory over Tainara Lisboa, and that was on the back end after losing a split decision, or sorry, not a split decision, but a pretty dominant decision at the hands of Casey O'Neill. Now, going back to that Casey O'Neill fight, that was a short notice fight that she took about a month after she had submitted Maria Agapova. She had to fly across the world. She had to cut weight, which we know she normally struggles with. And she was forced to fight against a fighter that did a good enough job in terms of stifling the grappling of Santos, which is where Santos often shines. And then from there, she couldn't keep up with the aggressive striking nature of O'Neill, and that ultimately led to Santos losing that fight on the scorecards. Like I said, she was able to bounce back against Tainara Lisboa, utilizing her grappling advantage, leading to that Americana finish at the ending of the 2nd round, showcasing that when she can get to her grappling, she's quite dominant and difficult to deal with. She trains out of Syndicate MMA as well as the UFC PI alongside her boyfriend, who is a former Contender Series alum in Alan Bagoso. And Bagoso is a guy that could easily make it to the UFC as well. But Santos, more of a grappler than anything, has a mediocre striking game, but if you can push enough of a pace in the striking realm, that's where you'll often have success against her, just as Casey O'Neill showed. Now, Melissa Croden had a dominant UFC debut against Tenora Lisboa back in October, where Croden was able to just bully Lisboa. She was able to land some takedowns, get her up against the cage, but ultimately it was in the third round where she was able to get a dominant position, rain down big shots, and force a TKO stoppage there. That made it 7-for-7 for Croden in terms of finishing all of her wins, although she does have 2 losses on her record, the last of which came in an LFA title fight where she came up short against eventual UFC signee Jacqueline Cavalcanti. That fight showed if Croden can't get to her physical style or did not have a striking advantage, that she will often end up coming up short against her opponents, and Cavalcanti stuffed the takedowns, maybe even had a little bit of takedown success of her own, but then outpointed Croden on the feet with superior striking. Croden does come from a Muay Thai background, so that's where you see her very physical inside the clinch with knees and elbows, but now we're seeing her lean on her BJJ. Before her last fight, she earned her BJJ brown belt, and we saw her put it on full display, leading to that TKO finish from that top position. I could see her leaning on that here defensively to try to stay away from an advantage that I think Santos has on the ground. If Croden can keep this fight standing, I think she can really butcher Santos on the feet in the clinch and in the striking game, where we've seen Santos often uncomfortable, especially when opponents are able to dictate the pace there. So if Croden can stuff the few takedowns that are going to be coming from Santos early, keep this fight standing, look for Croden to land more effective damage, and maybe even muster up a finish. This might be a fight where Santos realizes that she should do her best to try to make 125 pounds because she's going to be outsized here and, in my opinion, outstrengthed. I think outmuscled. I think Croden is just a much stronger, much bigger and tougher fighter here, and that's where I think we'll see Santos really struggle to get to her game. And I think that's another reason why Santos has gone from opening at -190 and dropping all the way down to -125 now on Tuesday of fight week. So give me Croden and maybe even a little bit of a sprinkle on her inside the distance prop at +360. I know it's harder for fighters to get finishes in the UFC given the steps up in competition they're going to be going up against, but Croden has a vicious and threatening style, and I think she can implement it here to eventually get a TKO finish over Santos. But at +105, even her money line looks pretty damn good. All right. Let's move over to the heavyweight division now, where we got Sean Sharaf coming in at +175, going up against Steven Asplund, who comes in at -205. Now, Sharaf is looking to build back after suffering a defeat in his short-notice UFC debut last year against Junior Tafa. Now, he started off that fight pretty well, so much so that all 3 judges scored that first round in his favor, but it was clear around that 3.5-minute mark that he was starting to slow down. All 4 of his pro wins have come in that first round, making short work of all of his opponents with that forward pressure and the power that he brings in his combinations. He is a U.S. Marine, and I think he's more of a guy that likes to scrap than he is actually a mixed martial artist. And I think that's the difference we saw in that Junior Tafa fight. He was able to get Tafa down a few times, but was unable to really hold him there. And then once he started to huff and puff, Tafa utilized his striking advantage to pick him apart and get a TKO finish in that second round. Now he's taken over a year and a half away from competition, just about a year and a half. I'd say closer to a year. But this Extreme Couture product is a guy that still has a lot of work to do. I just don't know if he's capable of really making it to the next level. Sure, he's, had many sparring sessions and training sessions with guys like Carl Williams, Francis Ngannou, and even Sergey Spivak, considering that his home base is Extreme Couture. But I think we saw in that Tafa fight that he might struggle if he can get that early finish. I think he'll show some of those struggles here against Steven Asplund, who seems to have a pretty good durability about him and a superior boxing game. Now, Asplund got a short notice call up to the Contender Series to take on Anthony Garasio, who's the most recent CFFC heavyweight champion at the time, and Asplund put it on him right away and finished him in 16 seconds, showcasing his superior striking skills. Going into that matchup, Asplund was a +180 underdog, and I was surprised at that. A lot of people were reading into the early finishing nature of Garasio, but they failed to look at the strength of schedule that Asplund had already gone up against, not to mention the striking advantage. Even though he may not have had a power advantage on paper, he showcased that if you can land the better shots, you'll be able to eventually find the finish, and that's what he did against Garasio. This is a guy that has had pretty stellar strength of schedule on the regional scene relative to the type of skill set that you'll see on the regional heavyweight scene. He even went up against a eventual LFA champion and UFC signee Denzel Freeman, obviously coming up short in that matchup, showcasing that when he's that behind in athleticism, strength, and speed, he's going to really struggle, especially against a guy who had a wrestling advantage the way that Freeman did. But Asplund is trying to improve his wrestling game to try to complement his boxing game, which is often where he finds his success. He's born into a fighting family, as his father was also a fighter that fought on the regional scene a ton. I believe he fought for Bellator once as well. But for the most part, Asplund is a guy that's been entrenched in the fighting game ever since he was a kid. He lost a bunch of weight, hence the weird physique that he has. And he's still a pretty big heavyweight as is. But his boxing skills will really help him, especially in a fight like this against Sharaf, who's a guy that utilizes more so of his power than his technique. And I think that we can see Asplund really counter that effectively here, landing the better shots and eventually getting Sharaf out of there probably late first round, early second round, similar to what Junior Tafel was able to do. Sharaf might look to try to expose some of the Asplund grappling defense, but I don't think he's going to be all that successful with it, and I think we'll see his cardio start to lack once again, and that's where Asplund has really dug deep in prior fights, and I expect him to do so once again here and eventually find that finish against Sharaf. Like I said, probably TKO, probably late first round or mid second round, but I'm going to go Asplund and Asplund inside the distance. All right, next up, in a welterweight matchup here, we got Neil Magny coming in at plus 300, going up against Yaroslav Amosov, who comes in at minus 400. Magny welcomes the former Bellator welterweight champion in his first UFC fight, and Magny is hoping to give him a pretty spoiled welcome, especially with the amount of experience he has fighting in the UFC for as long as he has. Now, Magny's on a 2-fight winning streak for the first time, I believe, since March of 2022. And if he earns a victory this weekend, this will be the first 3-fight winning streak he's been on since August of 2020. Now, we've seen superior grapplers really take advantage of him, and even in his last 2 matchups, we've seen him deal with that and be down on the scorecards, but manage to utilize his cardio and resistance effectively to wear his opponents down and really make them work harder from that top position. And then he's able to muster up that finish late second round like he did against Eliseo Zaleski, or in that third round like he did against Jake Matthews, who ended up pulling guillotine to start the third round because of how exhausted he was from trying to hold Magny on his back. But there are, that glaring hole can still be taken advantage of by superior wrestlers who have good enough cardio to really keep Magny on his back and, muzzle the type of resistance that he tries to have off of his back. At his best, the 38-year-old Magny weaponizes his cardio with forward movement, activity, mixing it up in the clinch and landing dirty boxing and some knees up the middle. But it's really, good kickers and great grapplers that are often able to get the better of him. Now he's going up against Yaroslav Amosov, who, one of the best prospects to come out of Bellator. I guess he never fought for PFL, so I'll just say Bellator at this point in time. He was their former welterweight champion. I believe defended against Diego Lima, defended against Logan Storley, and then he was supposed to have a routine title defense against Jason Jackson, a spot where he was a big favorite, but he gassed out. Jackson provided much more resistance than a lot of people were expecting, and we saw Jackson eventually muster up a third-round finish. Now, there may have been a few factors going into that why Amosov may not have been at peak condition as we've seen him in the past. Namely, the fact that he was a part of the Ukrainian army, which at the time was going up against a very tough circumstance, given the Russian war was really starting to take off at the time. And I think he was trying to balance, being a part of the military and training for the fight that he had against Jackson. I don't want to completely lay the blame on that, but that was a very un-Amosov-like performance, considering we've seen him go a hard 25 minutes in the past and really not have all that many issues. He's a very stellar striker as well as a great grappler. He can outstrike opponents, he can outscramble opponents, and just as he showed in his bounce-back victory over Curtis Millender earlier this year, he has a very slick submission game if he can have enough of an advantage over his opponents there. This is a interesting fight, one that Amosov should win and look like the minus 400 that he's at. But if his cardio is not in check, if the lack of activity as of late really starts to hinder him, maybe Magny can rely on his veteran experience to start wearing Amosov down and running away with this fight in deep water. But I really believe that Amosov is more than ready for this opportunity. An American top team product, a guy that has been training with high-level guys his entire career, probably extra motivated coming into his UFC debut, knowing that this is where he's wanted to be his entire career. Maybe we see the best version of him here. I think he gets to his grappling. I think he wears Magny down. I think he eventually finds the submission. I'm not going to be so keen in terms of taking that plus 200 submission prop, as I think there could be a better line there. But I think for the most part, we'll see Amosov dominate with his grappling, even has some success in the striking game, and I think he'll be in the driver's seat for the most part, and I think that allows him to eventually set up a submission and force a tap here against Magny. But I'm very excited that Amosov is getting into the UFC and getting right to work against a veteran like Magny. All right, let's move on to the featherweight division now, where we got Joanderson Brito coming in at minus 260, going up against Melsik Baghdasaryan, who comes in at plus 220. Now, Brito is riding a 2-fight losing streak for the first time in his career, and he's looking to keep that from getting to a 3-fight losing streak. This is a guy that was seen as a kind of a dark horse boogeyman in the featherweight division. The way that he disposed of Diego Lopez on the Contender streets way back in the day, kind of making Lopez quit, if we're being honest as well. And then coming into the UFC, 5-fight winning streak with all of those wins. He came into the UFC with a decision loss to Bill Algeo, a very weird and awkward fight for him. But then he managed to bounce back with 5 straight victories, all of those wins coming inside the distance, looking dominant pretty much the entire way, and looking like the shark that he has tattooed on his back. This is a very aggressive fighter, sometimes a little bit reckless, and guys like William Gomez and Pat Sabatini have been able to take advantage of that. But a guy that I think has kind of been underachieving in his UFC career thus far, but still a guy that's very capable of, making a splash still. He's only 30 years old. Sabatini did a great job in terms of landing 4 of the 5 takedown attempts on him and then controlling him for 14 of the 15 minutes. And just as we saw with Sabatini's last matchup against Chepe Mariscal, we know that his grappling is no joke. So you got to give Brito a little bit of slack there, or cut him a little bit of slack because of, the type of grappling he was dealing with in that matchup. But when he's the guy that can dictate the pace with his forward movement, aggressive striking, and very aggressive grappling approach, he's very tough to deal with. And I think he might be able to implement that here against Melsik Baghdasaryan, who really had his confidence stepped all over last time around against Gene Silva. Going into that matchup, Silva was a big favorite, and I really thought Baghdasaryan's striking could help him kind of muzzle Silva a little bit. But Silva had no respect for Baghdasaryan, started clowning on him a little bit early, and then eventually found that finish closer to the ending of the first round. And, now Baghdasaryan has to try to do that against another guy that's going to be trying to dictate the pace and really just put the hurting on him. Credit to Baghdasaryan for taking this kind of fight to try to bounce back from that loss, but I don't think that this is a great stylistic matchup for him. At his best, Baghdasaryan is a very good striker with good power, good speed, and early finishing capabilities. But when he goes up against guys that can snatch that momentum from him, guys that can dictate the pace, guys that have a grappling advantage as well, kind of like Joshua Kulibau, how, one little slip up from Baghdasaryan allowed Kulibau to get his back and submit him. Tucker Lutz had a little bit of success with his grappling, although he couldn't get off on too much damage. And then Gene Silva, who just snatched the momentum right away with his striking. Baghdasaryan may not be as good as a lot of people thought he would be when he first came into the UFC. Again, I think this is a bad stylistic matchup for him. I think Brito would snatch the momentum right away. I think he can win this fight either by walking Baghdasaryan down and landing his big shots, but I think the path he'll end up taking here, and which will be the path of least resistance, it's going to be the takedowns, it's going to be the top pressure, and then I think it's eventually going to be the submission game of Brito that allows him to submit Baghdasaryan. I love the under 2.5 here at minus 170. I think one of these guys ends up finding a finish. I think it's going to be the Brazilian. I think it's going to be Brito, and I think he gets this done within 2.5 rounds. I don't mind the chalk. I think he wins this fight quite convincingly. All right. Next up in the strawweight division, we got Amanda Lemos coming in at plus 160, going up against the streaking Jillian Robertson, who's quietly put together a 4-fight winning streak. She comes in at minus 185. Now we'll start off on the Lemos side of things here, who is coming off of a decision loss at the hands of Tatiana Suarez, a fight where she really struggled to get to her game. Suarez obviously able to land a plethora of takedowns, get some good control time, and really didn't have much success outside of that third round where Suarez was really starting to slow down and Lemos was able to land her big damage. That's kind of been, the kryptonite in Lemos' game is strong grapplers who can keep her on the mat and even look for submission opportunities, just like Vina Janjidoba did, just like Weili Zhang was able to muzzle her for 25 minutes and grind that fight out. But then we've seen her have glimpses of success where she's able to stop the takedowns or at least land enough damage and be threatening enough while giving up control time, just like she did when she fought Mackenzie Dern. Even the Yasmin Lucindo fight, she pulled a Uno card that night, as a lot of people thought Lucindo was going to be the one to land takedowns and control Lemos. It was actually the other way around. Lemos was the one landing takedowns and getting good top control time. She's very strong. She's very physical. She's very powerful as well with the strength that she's able to land with. Now she goes up against, the streaking Jillian Robertson, who, like I said, has put together a quiet 4-fight winning streak and has now put herself in a position to defeat a former title challenger and establish herself in that title picture. Very weird to say for a fighter like Jillian Robertson, who we really thought was going to kind of just fizzle into that mediocrity of the strawweight division. She's gone 6-1 over her last 7 fights. She went 7-5 through her first 12 UFC fights and now 6-1 over her last 7. A lot of that is thanks to her grappling, where she's been able to take opponents down and get those TKO wins like she did against Poliana Viena and Marina Rodriguez, or even just find perfect grappling opportunities to smother opponents from that top position like she did against Michelle Waterson-Gomez and Luana Pinheiro. She struggles in the striking realm where she doesn't have all that amount of confidence, but she's improving her ability to close the distance, get in on takedown attempts, and start establishing that dominant position. She's been one of my favorite fighters from when she first came in the UFC because of her submission over position style, but it seems like she's honing in on being a little bit cleaner with her technique so that she can actually get her hand raised rather than, giving up position and then allowing her opponents to get off on better success from that top position. This is a tough one, kind of surprised that Robertson finds herself at minus 185. I think a lot of people are reading into the grappling flaws in Lemos' game, but I think they're overlooking some of the strength and some of the ball of energy that Lemos is, right? I think that Robertson could struggle to, 1, get her down. I think Lemos is a stronger fighter, and 2, she may not be able to establish a dominant enough position against Lemos to actually work for a finish. She might be able to grind some rounds out, but I think Lemos, once this fight is on the feet, every round starts on the feet as well. I think Lemos can land those big shots, and I think she can crack the durability of Robertson and maybe even produce a knockout victory. So to get somebody like Lemos at plus 160, seeing how she survived on the ground like somebody like Mackenzie Dern, seeing some of the issues that she caused Tatiana Suarez, who on paper is a better wrestler than Robertson, I think Lemos is live to pull off the upset. So I'm going to go Lemos here. I'm going to go Lemos by knockout. I feel like this will be a tough one for Robertson to assert her grappling dominance, and that will leave her ripe for the picking on the feet against Lemos. So I'm going to go Lemos and Lemos by knockout, and probably one of my favorite underdogs on this entire card. All right, let's move on to the heavyweight division now, where we got Kennedy and Nzechukwu coming in at minus 125, going up against Marcus Buchecha, who comes in at plus 105. Now, we'll start off on the Nzechukwu side of things, who fell victim to the heel-hooking game of Walter Walker, and it only took Walker 54 seconds to drop for a heel hook and force the tap from the Nigerian fighter. Now, going into that fight, I did pick Nzechukwu, but I was a little bit questionable about the chalk that he was going into that matchup. I felt he was physical and strong enough to stop the takedowns of Walker and then be the better striker and pick him apart on the feet. But I failed to consider the fact that Walker, all he needs is a takedown attempt, and he's fine to just drop back for a heel hook and eventually get the submission the way that he did against Nzechukwu. And Walker continues to get off on that time and time again, especially with the streak that he's on right now. I think Nzechukwu was really hoping for a new life or breathe new life into his career by moving up to heavyweight. He's now 2-1 in the division, but still a guy at 33 years old that I feel like could make a little bit of noise, maybe find himself in that top 10 range of the heavyweight division, considering how thin that division is to begin with and how athletically gifted he is, something that he couldn't fully take advantage of in the light heavyweight division. But he's a guy that has mediocre boxing, mediocre grappling. It's really his athleticism and his size that has gotten him a lot of his wins in his career. Now he's going up against the high-level BJJ black belt Marcus Buchecha, who might be the best heavyweight BJJ practitioner, but as we saw in his fight against Martin Buday, which was his UFC debut, if he can't get to his takedowns, if he can't establish that dominant position, especially early, he's really going to struggle to get to his game and get to getting his hand raised. You know, we saw him get some late takedowns against Martin Buday, but he couldn't threaten with dominant positions to try to get finishes, which is why he ended up gassing out and even losing that third round as well. He's still trying to improve his traditional takedown game. He's trying to find ways to get the back of his opponents and really lean on that BJJ style, but his lack of striking really makes it hard for him to put anything in front of his grappling initiations, which was why he's had trouble against even guys like Rugrug, even guys like Martin Buday. He might be able to do it here against Nzechukwu, who might make some mistakes, but I don't think it will come down to that. I think we'll see Nzechukwu keep his distance, learn from the Walker fight, right? Like I'm seeing now over the last 24 hours, when I originally studied this fight, Nzechukwu was up at -155. Now he's down to -125, which makes me believe that people are reading into him getting submitted by Walter Walker in his last matchup and thinking Buchecha can do the same. But Buchecha is not a guy that's going to just drop for a heel hook and have as much confidence as Walker did. Buchecha seems like he is more so a guy that would kind of just pull guard and try to get a guy to come into his guard and try to get some work from there, or go for the traditional takedown attempt and try to just get to work from that top position. But I think he might struggle to do that here against Nzechukwu. I think we'll see Nzechukwu just touch him up from distance, maybe eventually muster up a TKO finish as Buchecha starts to slow down. But given the MMA experience, the strength of schedule of Nzechukwu, the harsh lesson that he learned in his last fight against Walter Walker, I think this is a very winnable fight for Nzechukwu. And historically speaking, I am not an Nzechukwu fan, but given the odds here and given the stylistic clash, I feel like this is a fight that Nzechukwu can win, and I'll take him to win this fight by TKO, and I don't mind him at -125 either. All right, let us move on to the next matchup in the featherweight division, as we have Melquizael Costa coming in at -105, going up against the Pirate, I believe his nickname is, Morgan Charriere, who comes in at -115. Now, Costa has been absolutely streaking ever since being knocked out by Steve Garcia. He's won 4 straight fights, submitting 2 of those opponents in Shailan Nurdenbeka, a fight where he was... I believe he stuffed all the takedowns from Nurdenbeka through the first round and a half and eventually got that submission in the second or third, and then jumped guillotine against Andre Fili and forced a tap there. But he stuffed pretty much all the takedowns from Christian Rodriguez and was able to land more damage and win that fight in the striking realm, and kind of did the same thing against Julian Erosa, where he was stuffing the takedowns and landing bigger damage to win that fight on the scorecards as well. Costa, usually very aggressive, maybe a little bit reckless in the striking realm, but loves to dictate the pace with his combinations, with his kicks, with his Muay Thai. And like I said, he does have a slick submission game if he finds his opponents lacking in certain aspects, especially when they might be shooting desperation takedowns or not minding their P's and Q's when they have him on the ground. I'm impressed with his ability to improve his takedown defense, which has allowed him to help dictate fights, especially where he feels most comfortable in the striking realm. He's going up against Morgan Charriere, who was down on this, or at least one scorecard going into the third round against Nate Landwehr. I believe he lost the first round and won the second round on 2 judges' scorecards, but then quickly got to his power in that third round and found that knockout victory over Nate the Train. Charriere is a guy that walks a fine line with the type of activity he brings to the table, because it's not all that high. He's looking for that perfect shot. He's looking for openings, and that usually allows opponents to get ahead of him, just as we saw in the Nathaniel Wood fight. Wood did a great job in terms of mixing in his striking activity with some takedowns, but he was the one in the driver's seat the entire time, where Charriere was just waiting too long and trying to land the perfect shot to try to get Wood out of there. And that's kind of been my issue with him. He's just not assertive enough in a lot of these fights. He's going to beat the Zucchinis and the Gabriel Mirandas, and he's going to be able to take advantage of the sketchy chin of Nate Landwehr. But if he can't get that finish and fights end up hitting the scorecards, things can get a little bit shaky for him. And in this matchup specifically, I feel like this is one where, given the line, and surprising that a little bit of love is coming in on Charriere to make him the very slight favorite, I feel like Costa is the side. Technically speaking, maybe Charriere is a better fighter, but game plan-wise, I feel like Costa will come in with a more effective game plan. I think we'll see him a little bit more assertive with his striking style. I think we'll see him land more shots. I think we'll see him moving forward. I think he'll keep Charriere busy while Charriere's just looking for that big shot. I think if Charriere wants to be successful, he's going to have to land those big shots, but also try to mix in some takedowns where he might be able to have some top success against Costa. But I think Costa will stay busier. I think he'll land better shots. And I think once this fight hits the scorecards, we'll see Costa end up getting his hand raised. Again, being the busier and more effective fighter. Could even look a little bit like the Nathaniel Wood fight, if I'm being honest. But I'm going to go I'm going to go Charriere here. I'm going to go Costa, and Costa by decision. Next up in the middleweight division, we got Cesar Almeida coming in at plus 175, going up against Cezary Oleksiejczuk, who comes in at minus 205. Now, starting off on the Almeida side of things, for some reason, going into studying this fight, I really thought the last fight on Almeida's record was his loss to Roman Kopylov. That one stood out to me so much because of how much disparity there was in terms of people picking the Almeida side and people picking the Kopylov side. I was one of the few that was actually on the Almeida side, as I thought he had shown a good enough takedown defense in prior fights that he'd force Kopylov to strike with him, and then from there I thought he'd be the superior striker. But Kopylov wrestled relentlessly, and it went to a split decision because of the type of damage Almeida was able to land, but ultimately two judges felt the takedowns and top control of Kopylov was enough for him to get the win that night. But Almeida has bounced back with 2 wins. The first one was against Ihor Potieria, where he stopped the takedowns and punished him on the feet to win a decision, and then back in January, the first card of the year, so it's only fitting that he's fighting on the last card of the year, but on the first card of the year, he went up against Abdul Razak Al Hassan, and I think as soon as that fight started, people realized that, Al Hassan, a former welterweight, was severely undersized in that matchup, but he still showcased that his power can be very effective at middleweight as he dropped and hurt Almeida very badly, but Almeida managed to recover, get back to his feet, and land a counter against a reckless barrage of shots that was coming back his way, and it put Al Hassan out clean. It was one of the nastier knockouts of the year that even I've forgotten about because it was the first card of the year, but he showed that he still has the power and ability to be very effective if he can keep fights in the striking realm. He's a nasty kickboxer. That's obviously the background that he had coming into the MMA world, but he is 37. He could be slowing down a little bit, once he fights more well-rounded fighters that can kind of strike with him a little bit, but also mix in takedowns and good control. That's where he's going to start to feel some issues and really start to come up short. He is a very fun, entertaining, and effective striker, but I just don't think he has as high of a ceiling as I was originally giving him credit for. Now, he's going up against a tough guy here in Cezary Oleksiejczuk, who just earned his contract through the Contender Series by taking on Theo Haig and finishing that very strong wrestler in 36 seconds. A lot of it was from hammer fist while he was defending a takedown, and then eventually big shots after that, after the referee stepped in. He is a very solid fighter. He is the brother of current UFC middleweight Michal Oleksiejczuk, and he could go down as the better of the two as well. He has a 16-3 record. He's 12-1, I believe. 13-1 over his last 14 fights. His only loss in that time came against a guy named Alibek Rasulov, who was 12-0 at the time, a smothering wrestler who still had some issues trying to hold Oleksiejczuk down. But Oleksiejczuk shows just as good of a striking game as his brother, but also a much better grappling game. And I feel like that's something that he may rely on a little bit more in this fight against Almeida. Even if this ends up being a pure striking battle, I feel it can be somewhat competitive. But I believe the reason Oleksiejczuk has bounced all the way up to minus 205 is because of that grappling edge he should hold in this fight. And I think his striking skills complement his grappling skills well enough that he'll be able to get in on good enough takedown attempts here against Almeida and really start to wear him down from that top position. Normally I'm skeptical about guys coming off the Contender Series, especially with quick knockout wins. But when you have somebody as experienced as Oleksiejczuk and has fought for some pretty good promotions across the pond and a good strength of schedule, I feel like he's already UFC ready enough. May even be the most UFC ready off the most recent season of the Contender Series. And I think that will work out for him here. And I think that will allow him to grind out the Brazilian, allowing Oleksiejczuk to win this fight on the scorecards. All right, that now brings us to our featherweight co-main event between strikers Giga Chikadze, who comes in at plus 245, going up against the youngster Kevin Vallejos, who comes in at minus 285. Now, Chikadze has really started to fall off in terms of the effectiveness and kind of the hype that he had during that winning streak he had going in to that main event slot against Calvin Kattar. He ended up getting outworked in that first round, and then Kattar was able to just run away with that fight over the next four. Chikadze did manage to bounce back against Alex Caceres about a year and a half after that loss to Kattar, and since then, though, he is now 0-2. He's had strong first rounds against Arnold Allen and David Onama, but those guys start to really pressure Chikadze, mix in some grappling, mix in some takedowns, and really start to wear down the gas tank of Chikadze, and that's where those guys were able to win rounds 2 and 3 and win those fights on the scorecards. Chikadze, obviously very nasty kickboxer, has a nasty body kick. He has the Giga kick that he's been able to crumple a few guys with, hitting the liver of his opponents and dropping them. Very dangerous in the striking realm, but it's been his grappling where he's often fell short. He showed some decent grappling defense through his first run in the UFC, or at least the early part of his UFC run, but as he gets deeper into his career, starts to get up there in age, it seems like his defensive grappling chops are really starting to fall off. I feel like that could get challenged here. Even though Vallejos is more known as a striker, I think we're starting to see Vallejos really start to round out his game, knowing that he's going to have to mix in some grappling if he hopes to still be successful. With a very impressive 16-1 record, the only loss on Vallejos' record came back in 2023 when he came up short against Gene Silva, and we don't really have to explain that loss for Vallejos considering what Gene Silva has done to date. But Vallejos managed to bounce back with 2 title defenses on the regional scene. He earned another opportunity on the Contender Series against Cam Teague, made short work of him, and then made it to the UFC, made short work of Sung-Woo Choi, and then had a great battle against Danny Silva earlier this year where he picked him apart. It went to the scorecards, but I thought it was obvious that he landed more effective damage and was able to land more of the significant strikes and show that he was the one landing with more power, even though Danny Silva may have had a little bit of a technical striking advantage. And the same could be said in this matchup. Chikadze may be the better striker on paper, but I believe the youth advantage, the speed, and the power that Vallejos presents, mixed in with some of the grappling he could implement in this fight, could really be the downfall of Chikadze. I can understand why Vallejos has ballooned from minus 240 to minus 285. He's the better, well-rounded mixed martial artist, and I believe Chikadze is really starting to get on the decline. After a competitive first round, I expect Vallejos to start taking over, mixing in those takedowns, grinding this fight out, and I'm picking the Argentinian to win this matchup. Argentinian? I feel like it's Argentine. I feel like the Argentine will pull away in rounds 2 and 3, similar to what Arnold Allen and David Onama were able to do against Chikadze, and that should lead to a Vallejos decision victory. All right. That now brings us to the main event and the last fight of the 2025 schedule for the UFC. We got a flyweight scrap between former title challenger Brandon Royval coming in at plus 215, going up against Manel Kape, who comes in at minus 255. Now Royval is coming off of a decision loss to eventual and current UFC flyweight champion Joshua Van. That fight took place back in June, where Royval took Joshua Van on short notice after he was originally scheduled to fight Manel Kape. Kape was forced to pull out. In steps Joshua Van, and we probably got fight of the night that night, as both of these guys combined for close to, I believe, 420 significant strikes. It was an absolute barn burner between the two, but it was very much Van who was landing the more effective damage, landing better combinations, and Royval very much struggling to keep up with that. Royval is a very chaotic fighter who's kind of dialed it in as of late. His wins against Brandon Moreno and Tetsuro Taira are examples of that, but we see if he is, behind on the technical striking and he can't really get to his high pressure style, he really starts to come up short against some of his opponents. He can be controlled on the ground, but he's slowly getting better in that, just as we saw against Tetsuro Taira in that pivotal 5th round where I thought it was 2-2 going into the final round, and it seemed like he was going to get grinded out in that final round as Taira got a dominant position, but Royval stayed squirmy enough and scrambly enough to get out of that spot and get off on his damage to run away with that fight late. He's a fun fighter, probably one of my favorite flyweights, but I think we've seen that his ceiling is, maybe title shot or maybe gatekeeper for a title shot. And I think we'll see that once again this weekend as he faces the hard-hitting style of Manel Kape. Now, Manel Kape is a guy that started his UFC career 0-2, really fizzled off that hype that he had coming from Rizin, where he had, a big win over Kaya Sakura, a guy that a lot of people thought would get to the flyweight title fight sooner than later. But, injuries, weight issues, the loss to Muhammad Makhachev, even the first 2 losses that he had in the UFC provided speed bumps for him. But now he's 4-1 over his last 5 fights, finishing his last 2 opponents in the 3rd round, Bruno Silva and Asu Almabayev, and now being put in a spot where he could potentially be a number 1 contender if he comes out with a big win here. I think he has the perfect striking style to counter the chaotic style of Royval. I think Kape also has the speed advantage, which will help him land bigger and more effective shots against Kape. And I think this could look a little bit more lopsided than the Joshua Van fight did for Royval. I think Kape has the advantage of the speed and power, and that could ultimately be the difference maker here. If Royval wants to try to get crafty and try to get this into the grappling realm, I do not think he has good enough wrestling to force Kape to grapple with him, and I think Kape can just keep this fight in his wheelhouse, and that will allow him to pick apart Royval. I think Royval has good enough durability to survive 25 minutes, but it would not entirely surprise me if Kape did end up finding that big shot to knock Royval out either. But in terms of an official prediction, I'm going to go Kape and Kape by decision, landing bigger, better shots, winning clearly at least 4 of the 5 rounds, and he secures himself probably not as the next number 1 contender because we got Tetsuro Taira there, but he should end up fighting for the title in 2026, depending on how active Joshua Van and Tetsuro Taira end up being. But I think Kape wins pretty dominantly here, and I feel like minus 250 is a little bit generous. I did see the line go up to about minus 300 last night. Now it's back down to about minus 250, but I think that this is still a very playable and winnable line for Kape. Give me Kape by decision. There you guys go. Full card breakdown for UFC Vegas 112, the last UFC card of the year. Again, PFL Europe 4 goes down the afternoon before this fight. Probably Thursday, I'll drop my PFL Europe breakdown, so stay tuned for that. And then again, ending off the year, we got KSW, PFL Africa, and OKTAGON 81. I'll have written breakdowns for those on the MMALOTN Patreon page. I might do main event breakdowns for those for you guys on the YouTube page, but the majority of those breakdowns will be on the Patreon page. All right. I'll see you guys again tomorrow for the top 3 Lock of the Night candidates, as well as my Chalk or Not segment. I'll see you guys then. Peace.